The moment the headlights of Maria's sleek sedan cut through the heavy Manhattan downpour, the fragile piece inside Lee Choi's luxury penthouse disintegrated. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass window, a towering silhouette of muscle and quiet malice, his dark eyes tracking the vehicle as it idled near the estate gates. Up his neck and wrists, the dark, intricate tattoos of his Korean syndicate lineage seemed to tighten with his rising blood pressure. Choi didn't flinch. He didn't pace. But his large knuckles turned bone-white against the marble ledge. His beautiful, dark beard, the very feature Maria always teasingly claimed had trapped her heart, trapped only a sharp, ragged breath now. He didn't need a sniper rifle to see what was happening inside that car. His possessive gaze, sharpened by years of ruling a ruthless underworld empire, locked onto the two figures through the rain-streaked windshield. Maria, his beautiful black American wife of 3 years, was leaning across the console. And next to her sat Han Byum-suk. Choi knew the man's face. He was Maria's corporate colleague, a man who had been showing up far too often. From this distance, it looked like an intimate, forbidden world. For 2 agonizing hours, the car engine ran, and for 2 agonizing hours, Choi watched them talk, the shadows of their silhouettes blurred by the storm. His mind, poisoned by pride and the toxic paranoia of his lifestyle, wrote a narrative of betrayal that froze his blood to stone. Before we dive deeper into this intense battle of pride and passion, make sure to subscribe to Crimson Petal and hit the notification bell, so you never miss a single chapter of this original story. When the car door finally opened, Maria stepped out into the rain, shielding her head as she hurried toward the mansion. The sedan pulled away into the dark city. Moments later, the heavy oak doors of the penthouse clicked open, but the woman who walked in was met with a vacuum of pure ice. The silence in the living room was thick, a suffocating velvet that only Maria seemed brave enough to breathe through. She stood at 26, her rich mahogany skin glistening with faint drops of rain, her hair damp but her posture completely unbroken. Her clear, intelligent eyes met Choi's lethal, predatory glare with a level of calm that bordered on defiance. To the underworld, Choi was a monster who moves billions with a whisper. To Maria, tonight, he was just a husband letting his demons run the house. "You're late," Choi remarked, his voice a gravelly rasp that vibrated low in the floorboards. He didn't move from the window, keeping his massive frame rigid, hiding the desperate tremor in his chest. "I didn't know your corporate meetings required sitting in a dark driveway for 2 hours. Maria didn't flinch. She slowly unbuttoned her coat, her expression shifting from exhaustion to a cold, smooth, unimpressed mask. "It was an important conversation, Choi. Some things can't be rushed." Her clinical indifference was a direct strike to his ego. The seed of jealousy was officially planted, deep and toxic. He looked at her, searching for guilt, but found only unbreakable dignity. The silent war had officially begun. The tension didn't dissolve with the morning sun. It curdled. Driven by a toxic mixture of wounded pride and possessive fury, Choi decided that if Maria could play games, he could play them better. By noon, the massive penthouse was no longer just their battleground. Choi had intentionally invited Sira, a stunning female colleague from a powerful allied syndicate, under the thin guise of urgent territory logistics. He wanted to see a crack in Maria's unbreakable armor. He wanted her to feel the burning, suffocating heat of jealousy that had kept him awake all night. When Maria walked into the dining room that evening, she froze for a fraction of a second. Sira was already seated close to Choi, laughing softly at something he said. Her fingers brushed lightly against the dark tattoos on his forearm. Choi looked up, his sharp jaw set, his predatory eyes locked on his wife to catch the exact moment her heart broke. But Maria refused to give him the satisfaction. Instead of throwing a tantrum or demanding answers, she drew a heavy cloak of pure ice around herself. She stepped into the room with an elegant, slow confidence, her mahogany skin radiant against a simple cream dress. She didn't glare at Sira, She didn't even acknowledge her presence. She simply sat across from them, ordered the house staff to bring her dinner, and ate in absolute, terrifying serenity. When Sierra tried to make polite conversation, Maria responded with short, smooth, clinical answers that made the syndicate heiress look small and desperate. "The weather is dreadful tonight, isn't it, Mrs. Lee?" Sierra murmured, trying to fill the heavy silence. "I quite like the rain," Maria replied, her voice a calm, melodic wave that didn't hold a single tremor. She looked directly at Choi, her eyes piercing right through his manufactured facade. "It washes away the things that refuse to move on." Choi's knuckles turned white around his silver fork. He was trying to punish her, but her absolute indifference was driving him insane. To push the blade deeper, Choi leaned over and whispered something private into Sierra's ear, loud enough for Maria to hear the rustle of clothing, but quiet enough to hide the words. Sierra chuckled, pressing her palm flat against his chest. "Sierra will be spending the night in the East Wing," Choi announced coldly, his gaze cutting to his wife. "Our meetings will run into the early hours of the morning. The house is large enough for many guests, husband," Maria said smoothly, setting her linen napkin down with a soft, decisive tap. "Enjoy your logistics." She stood up, said goodnight to no one in particular, and walked out of the room with her chin held high. But the true tragedy struck the following morning. Believing she had won the psychological round, Maria walked downstairs early to fetch a glass of water. As she passed the closed doors of the guest suite, her foot brushed against something on the polished marble floor. She leaned down and picked it up. It was a delicate, expensive gold earring belonging to Sierra. A sharp, physical ache bloomed in Maria's chest, so intense it made her breath snag in her throat. She stared at the jewelry, her mind instantly painting a devastating picture of what had happened behind those closed doors while she slept alone. The misunderstanding was absolute, and the blade was driven straight through her heart. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She carefully placed the earring on the console table, walked back to her room, and officially locked the door to her heart. The 6-month countdown of total silence had just begun. The gold earring on the console table became the boundary stone of a new, terrifying era in the mansion. For 6 agonizing months, the luxury Manhattan penthouse transformed into a sensory vacuum. Lee Choi and Maria lived under the same roof not as husband and wife, nor even as bitter enemies, but as total strangers. They passed each other in the wide, marble hallways like 2 elegant ghosts trapped in a haunting of their own making. The vibrant, fiery love that had once defined their marriage was replaced by a clinical, suffocating detachment. They still shared the massive master bed. Their pride was too immense to allow either to retreat to a guest room and admit defeat. But a physical chasm opened between them. They lay back to back, millimeters apart, the air vibrating with an intense, agonizing heat. It was a psychological torment. In the quiet darkness of the night, Choi would stare at the wall, his chest tightening as he listened to the soft, rhythmic sound of Maria's breathing. His body burned to turn around, to reach across the sheets and pull her rich, mahogany skin against his chest, to bury his face in her hair and beg her to tell him why she had looked so broken in that car 6 months ago. But his stubborn, syndicate pride forced him to remain rigid as stone. Maria's inner dialogue was no less chaotic, a constant, dizzying spiral of funny, painful, and deeply sexy contradictions. One Tuesday morning, she purposely took her time dressing, sliding a sheer, silk robe over her shoulders just as Choi walked into the dressing room to select his suit. Through the reflection of the glass mirrors, their eyes locked. For 3 breathless seconds, the air evaporated. Choi's gaze dropped to the curve of her waist, his sharp jaw tightening, his pulse visibly spiking against the dark ink on his neck. Maria felt her own heart hammer violently against her ribs. She wanted to turn around, tease him about how hard he was trying not to look, and drag him down onto the rug the way they used to. Instead, she simply pulled the silk tight, gave him a completely blank, unimpressed glance, and walked past him without a single word. Choi recoiled as if he had been physically struck, his fists clenching in his pockets. This was their daily dance. A heavy, silent Cold War where physical proximity was weaponized. When they absolutely had to attend corporate dinners or syndicate functions together, they played the roles of a powerful power couple to absolute perfection. Choi would place his heavy hand at the small of her back, and Maria would lean into his side, smiling effortlessly for the cameras. But the moment the car doors closed on the ride home, the masks fell, the smiles vanished, and the freeze returned. They were two masters of control, desperately starving for each other's touch, using the silence to cut each other deeper than any blade ever could. The mental wounds were multiplying, the unspoken assumptions hardening into an unyielding wall of ice. They couldn't survive the vacuum much longer. The pressure inside the penthouse was reaching its absolute breaking point. The silence had become a physical weight, something so heavy that Maria felt it pressing against her lungs every time she walked into a room. She was done playing the ghost. If he wanted to treat her like an enemy, she would start acting like a distraction. It was a Thursday evening, the air in the penthouse cool and artificial. Maria spent an hour in front of her vanity, not to prepare for a gala, but to wage war on her husband's self-control. She chose a floor-length emerald silk slip dress, the fabric clinging to her mahogany skin like a second layer of molten glass. It was backless, sophisticated, and intentionally weaponized to break him. She walked into the private study, the room where Choi spent hours staring at screens, convinced he was building an empire while actually just building a tomb for their marriage. He was sitting at his massive mahogany desk, his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing the dark, winding ink of his syndicate tattoos. When the door clicked shut, his eyes snapped up, instantly sharpening into 2 points of obsidian fire. "You're wandering, Maria," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that usually sent shivers down her spine. He kept his gaze fixed on his tablet, his knuckles white as he forced himself to stay seated. Maria didn't answer immediately. She walked toward him with a slow, deliberate grace, the silk whispering against the floor. She stopped right at the edge of his desk, forcing him to either look at her or stare at his own hands. She leaned forward, the scent of vanilla and expensive jasmine drifting into his space. She watched his chest hitch, just once. It was the only crack in his armor, but it was enough. "I was just remembering," she said, her voice smooth, honeyed, and laced with a teasing, wicked humor. She reached out and traced the edge of his paperweight, her eyes locked on his. "You used to be so sweet, Choi. So caring. You wouldn't be able to keep your hands off me if I walked into a room like this." She let a small, cynical laugh escape her lips. "I guess that man is dead, isn't he? Replaced by this cold statue." Choi's breath hitched again, his gaze finally snapping up to hers. His eyes were wide, dark, and filled with a volatile mixture of longing and agony. He looked like a man starving to death in front of a feast. "Don't," he commanded, his voice cracking slightly. "Don't play these games, Maria. Not tonight." "Why not?" she whispered, leaning closer, her hand moving to rest on the edge of his chair, trapping him. "Is it too hard to focus on your territory logistics when I'm standing right here? Remember how you used to be? The blindfolds, the gifts, the way you always looked at me like I was the only thing holding your world together?" She leaned down, her lips brushing past his ear, her tone dripping with mock sweetness. "My hubby is so sweet. Or at least he was. Now he just acts like I'm a ghost." Choi's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist, not to pull her away, but to steady himself. His grip was scorching. For a moment, it felt like the old fire, the raw, unbridled need he used to have. He was trembling, a violent, masculine shudder running through his frame. He wanted to pull her into his lap, to rip away the silk and remind her of every inch of her body, but the memory of the earring, the poison in his mind, stopped him. He forced himself to drop her hand, his eyes burning with a desperate, painful defiance. "You dressing like that won't change my mind," he lied, his voice sounding like broken glass. He stood up abruptly, pacing toward the window to get away from the torture of her presence. He was sweating, his back turned to her, his posture rigid as he fought the urge to beg her to never dress like that again. Because the sight of her was shattering the very foundation of his cold, prideful resolve. The scorching heat of the study evaporated by the next morning, replaced by a finality that felt as heavy and gray as a tomb. When Choi walked into the sunlit dining room, the usual spread of breakfast was entirely missing from the long, polished mahogany table. In its place sat a neat stack of white papers, topped by a heavy silver pen. Maria was already there, sitting rigidly in her chair. She wore a tailored black suit that made her look more like a corporate executioner than a wife. Her hair was pulled back tightly, and her eyes, usually so deep and expressive, were completely flat. The playful, sultry woman who had pushed him to his absolute limit the night before had vanished. Choi froze at the doorway. His sharp eyes scanned the document from a distance, recognizing the bold, sterile lettering at the top immediately. Petition for dissolution of marriage. A violent wave of nausea hit him, but his syndicate training took over, freezing his features into a mask of pure, unbothered arrogance. He walked forward slowly, his heavy leather shoes clicking against the marble floor, and pulled out his chair across from her. They looked at each other like two opposing generals signing a ceasefire after a bloody, pointless war. "Is this your newest project?" Choi asked, his voice a dead, emotionless rasp. He picked up the silver pen, rolling it between his large, tattooed fingers with a careless ease that hid the fact that his pulse was roaring in his ears. 6 months of silence just to hand me a few sheets of paper? "It's an ultimatum, Choi," Maria said quietly, her voice steady but hollowed out by months of unspoken agony. "The silence was your choice. This is mine. I won't live as a decoration in a house that feels like a prison. Sign them." "You think it's that simple?" Choi leaned back, his gaze cutting into her like a blade. The pride that had poisoned his mind for half a year refused to let him bend, even as his world was tearing at the seams. "You walk out of this house, Maria, and you walk away from everything. My name, my protection, our life." "We don't have a life," she countered sharply, the first crack appearing in her icy facade. Her fingers clenched tightly into the fabric of her skirt beneath the table. "We have an agreement. You decided 6 months ago that I wasn't worth your trust. You brought another woman into our home, Choi. You left her gold earring outside my door like a trophy." Choi's hand stopped rolling the pen. He blinked, a genuine flash of confusion breaking through his stony expression before his jaw tightened again. He hadn't known about the earring. He hadn't known that his petty attempt to make her jealous had grown into a monstrous lie in her mind. But instead of explaining, his stubbornness flared. He didn't want to admit he had been trying to hurt her because he was hurting. "If that's what you believe, then your mind was already made up," he said coldly, placing the pen firmly back onto the papers. "I don't sign things under threat, Maria. Then we let the lawyers tear apart whatever is left of us," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that sounded dangerously close to breaking. They sat in the suffocating silence, both hiding the devastating truth that their hearts were shattering into a million pieces, neither willing to drop their armor first. The thin veneer of legal formality shattered the moment Maria reached into her briefcase. Instead of pulling out more legal documents, she produced a small, velvet-lined wooden box and slammed it onto the mahogany table. The sudden, violent sound echoed through the cavernous room like a gunshot. The box popped open, its contents spilling carelessly across the sterile white pages of the divorce petition. Choi's eyes dropped to the pile, and for the first time in 6 months, his breath caught completely in his throat. Resting on top of the legal papers was a collection of their most sacred memories. A pressed, faded crimson petal from the bouquet he had given her on their first anniversary, a silver key to the tiny, cramped apartment they had shared before his ascension to the head of the syndicate, and right in the center, a luxurious black silk blindfold. "What is this?" Choi demanded, his voice dropping its clinical edge, replaced by a raw, ragged tremor. "It's the evidence of what we murdered," Maria said, her voice finally breaking as a single. Hot tears spilled over her eyelashes, cutting a path down her mahogany skin. She stood up so quickly her chair scraped loudly against the marble. "You want to act like a heartless kingpin? Fine. But don't look at those papers and pretend I'm the one walking away from us. I kept everything, Choi. I kept every promise, every memory, even when you turned this house into an Arctic wasteland." She picked up the black silk blindfold, her fingers trembling violently as she held it out toward him. "Remember this? The night you told me that even if the whole world went dark, even if your enemies took your eyes, you would always know the touch of my skin? You swore you could find me in the dark." She threw the blindfold at his chest. It fluttered down, brushing against his tattooed neck before resting on his lap. "You aren't blind, Choi. You just refuse to look at me." The raw, heavy agony poured out of her in a suffocating torrent, washing away the 6 months of icy detachment in a matter of seconds. The physical closeness of the items on the table contrasted beautifully and tragically against the massive emotional chasm that still separated them. Choi stared at the blindfold in his lap, his large hands shaking. The memory of the night he had given it to her. A night filled with breathless whispers, desperate, possessive kisses, and absolute vulnerability, slammed into his chest like a physical blow. He had thought he was protecting his pride by staying silent, but looking at the box of memory gifts, he realized he had merely been torture testing the woman he loved. "Maria," he whispered, his stoic Mafia composure finally fracturing down the middle. He stood up, his massive frame towering over the table, his dark beard hiding the desperate twitch of his jaw. He wanted to cross the distance, to snatch her into his arms and crush his lips against hers until the pain disappeared. But the toxic phantom of Han Byum-suk still stood between them, a dark shadow in the rain that his pride wouldn't let him ignore. The mention of her loyalty didn't pacify the monster in Choi. It provoked him. The suppressed, suffocating jealousy that had poisoned his mind for half a year finally erupted. He slammed his heavy palms onto the mahogany table, leaning forward until his shadow completely swallowed her. "You talk of promises, Maria," his voice boomed, a terrifying, gravelly roar that made the window panes vibrate. "You talk of keeping everything? Then tell me what you gave away in that car 6 months ago. I stood right at that window and watched you sit with Han Byum-suk for 2 hours. 2 hours in the dark, while my world burned with the thought of another man touching what is mine." Maria took a half step back, her eyes widening. The sudden, explosive revelation hit her like a physical shock wave. Then, slowly, the shock turned into absolute, furious disbelief. "The car?" she whispered, a harsh, cynical laugh cutting through her tears. "You ruined our marriage over what you saw through a rainy windshield?" "I saw what I saw." Choi rages, his dark eyes flashing with a dangerous, feral intensity. "A man leaning toward my wife. A woman comforting him in the dead of night. He was weeping, you fool." Maria fiercely shouted back, her voice matching his volume, shattering the last remnants of his stoic composure. She stepped right back up to the edge of the table, her face inches from his. Han Byum-suk's wife had died in an accident 3 days prior. He had a severe panic attack in the passenger seat of my car because he couldn't face going back to an empty apartment. I wasn't betraying you, Choi. I was stopping a grieving, broken man from driving himself into a brick wall. The truth hit Lee Choi like a physical blow to the sternum. He staggered backward, his hands dropping from the table as his chest heaved. The room suddenly felt entirely devoid of air. His wife. Choi stammered, his gravelly voice instantly deflating, turning weak and hollow. Yes. He was drowning in grief, and I was being a human being, Maria said, her voice dropping from a shout to a devastating, shivering whisper. But you didn't ask. You never asked. Your syndicate pride is so colossal, your paranoia so thick, that you assumed the worst. You built a prison out of your own assumptions, Choi, and you locked me in it for 6 months. The ruthless kingpin. The man who moved billions and commanded empires with a single nod. Completely deflated. The heavy armor he had worn for half a year dissolved into nothingness. He looked down at his large, tattooed hands, suddenly seeing them not as weapons of power, but as the tools that had broken his own home. He had let his pride blind him to the point of tragedy. He looked up at Maria, his eyes wide and trembling, completely bare of any malice. The realization was monumental. His crown meant absolutely nothing if he had to sit on the throne alone. The revelation hung in the air, heavier than the rain that had started to batter the penthouse windows once again. Choi looked at the black silk blindfold in his hands, then up at Maria. The distance between them, which had felt like a vast, icy ocean for 6 months, dissolved in a fraction of a second. He crossed the room in 2 massive strides, his pride entirely dead, replaced by a desperate, consuming hunger. He caught her by the waist, his large, tattooed hands pulling her rich, mahogany skin tightly against his chest. Maria gasped, her hands instinctively flying up to press against his broad shoulders, intending to push him away. But the moment her fingers felt the familiar, frantic thudding of his heart, her resistance crumbled. "I'm sorry," Choi whispered, his voice cracking completely as he buried his face in the crook of her neck. "Maria, I'm so sorry. I let the darkness in. I stopped looking at you. I was terrified of losing you, and I almost destroyed us myself." "You idiot," she sobbed, but her arms wrapped around his neck, holding him just as fiercely. Choi lifted her chin, his dark eyes brimming with an uncharacteristic, raw vulnerability. He leaned down and crushed his lips against hers. The kiss was explosive, a redemptive, passionate collision of 6 months of starved affection, unspoken apologies, and surviving love. It was deep, fierce, and breathless. Maria melted into him, her fingers tangling in his dark beard, reclaiming her place as the undisputed queen of his heart. The icy vacuum of the penthouse instantly evaporated, replaced by a searing, healing heat. When he finally pulled back, just an inch, his lips brushed against hers as he spoke. He reached over with one hand, picked up the divorce papers, and tore them completely down the middle, throwing the pieces into the glowing fireplace nearby. "Those are gone. You are my wife, Maria. I will spend every single day of the rest of my life making sure you never feel like a ghost in your own home again." Maria let out a soft, breathless laugh, the heavy tears on her cheeks drying as a flash of her old, playful, and sexy confidence returned to her eyes. She reached into his hand, took the black silk blindfold, and wrapped it gently around his eyes, tying it securely behind his head. "Prove it," she whispered mischievously, stepping back just a few inches into the warm, dimly lit room. "You swore you could always find me in the dark, Lee Choi. No more assumptions. No more hiding behind your empire." With his vision completely blocked, the ruthless kingpin smiled. A genuine, beautiful smile that hadn't crossed his face in half a year. He didn't hesitate. Guided only by the scent of jasmine, the sound of her breath, and the undeniable magnetic pull between them, he stepped forward and unerringly caught her waist again, pulling her into a warm, permanent embrace. The silent war was over. Their marriage wasn't just saved. It was unbreakable. If you loved this emotional journey of pride, passion, and true reconciliation, make sure to subscribe to Crimson Petal, hit that notification bell, and leave a comment below telling us your favorite moment between Choi and Maria.